Good afternoon, everyone. I am Tony Davis, Director of Community Outreach and Health here at the New York Fed. And welcome to the New York Fed. And I want to thank you all for joining us today for this very important and timely conversation regarding racial wealth gap and health equity. So before I get into my comments, I just want to share a few housekeeping remarks. So today's event is just 1.5 hours, so we will not take any breaks. But if you need to use the restroom, they're out near the elevator banks that you guys pass through to get here. That's one. Two, this event is being recorded, and it will be shown on the public web page shortly after this event. And last but not least, if you guys are so interested, please stick around for the networking reception after the event. So before I go any further, let me note my disclaimer. The views I express today are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or the Federal Reserve System. You can tell I've said that a time or two in my day. Alrighty, so our community development team, about 2.5, 3 years ago, we underwent a new strategic direction where we decided to focus closely on 3 topics that we can really focus in on and make impact. And those areas include climate adaptation and resiliency, household financial well-being, and of course, health equity, the reason why we're here today. So within that whole new strategic direction, our ultimate goal is really to connect emerging solutions, especially those focused on fostering racial equity and improving life for underserved communities with capital. That's ultimately what we're trying to do with our new direction. So for today's event, participants will discuss the connection between health and wealth, how to better measure both, and how policy can help address wealth gaps. So at this time, I would like to thank the New York City Health Department for their partnership on this, for working on this very important issue and working so closely with us. I also want to thank our all-star panelists for joining us. We know that you guys are super busy, so thank you for taking time out of your schedules to be with us this afternoon. And last but not least, I want to thank some of my colleagues here at the bank, Devon Bodie, who you guys will hear from later today, Kelly Jackson, Ellen Simon, and many others that you will see floating around for making today's event what I'm sure is going to be a success. So that is actually all I have. So I have the privilege, actually, of introducing Janice Bowder. Unfortunately, Janice wasn't able to join us today, but she did send pre-recorded remarks. And for those of you who don't know, Janice is the counselor to the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Treasury. So thank you, and I hope you all enjoy the program.
Good afternoon. My name is Janice Fowler, and I have the privilege of serving as the U.S. Treasury Department's first ever counselor for racial equity. I'm sorry I can't be there for what I'm certain will be a dynamic conversation, but I'm thrilled that you are looking at the intersections of economic and health equity. The discussion you all will have today comes at a critical time. Today, economic opportunity and health outcomes remain a geographic phenomenon. I'm sure you are all quite familiar with the research showing your life outcomes are directly correlated to your zip code. We've seen the pattern repeated in small towns, urban centers, and suburbs across the country. Everywhere, health and economic success are bottlenecked by place and therefore often by race. But what feels different today are the incredible tools we have been given by Congress to address the structural economic inequity that is holding too many people back and leaving talent and potential sidelined during a time of global economic competitiveness. The American Rescue Plan, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, CHIPS, and Inflation Reduction Act are once-in-a-generation investments in our economy and in communities that have long suffered from climate change and environmental injustices. Secretary Yellen has put forth a bold vision for catalyzing a more inclusive economy called modern supply-side economics. This approach calls for boosting economic productivity and addressing inequality by making investments in people, places, and infrastructure that have been constrained by lack of resources and unequal access to opportunity. It's with this framework in mind that Treasury has made several critical decisions in the implementation of the American Rescue Plan to ensure that small towns, cities, counties, and states have the resources and flexibility needed to respond to the pandemic. Now we are charged with implementing $270 billion in new green tax credits and working with the IRS to transform tax administration to a 21st century customer service experience. I'll briefly share a bit more about both efforts and how we are centering equity along the way. The American Rescue Plan represents a historic commitment to support those most impacted by the pandemic. While the legislation itself embodied this commitment in numerous ways, the key to success of ARP's programs lied in their implementation. Treasury worked closely with the White House and across federal agencies to execute a coordinated strategy to support people in underserved communities across the country, including communities of color. The department was guided by the core principles of engaging the most impacted communities, implementing with additional flexibilities to meet the needs of marginalized communities, and providing capital to historically underserved groups. To avoid burdensome requirements that risk cutting off vulnerable populations from accessing rental assistance, Treasury encouraged key flexibilities in the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, including the use of self-attestation for program eligibility and direct-to-tenant payments. We also encouraged investment in culturally relevant partners, worked with Black and Spanish language media, and convened unions and faith leaders. The effort paid off. Our data shows that over 80% of ERA recipients are very low-income families, and that funds have reached a diverse range of households. Researchers have found that ERA beneficiaries have not only received financial benefits from the program, but have also seen other positive effects on their well-being, such as improved mental health outcomes. Treasury also provided for broad eligible uses for state and local fiscal recovery funds in disproportionately impacted communities. We required large recipients to describe how projects prioritize economic and racial equity and how their planning incorporated the feedback of constituents and community-based organizations. Treasury's flexible design empowered local leaders who were closest to the problem to identify the solutions most meaningful for their communities. These funds help fight the pandemic, support families and businesses struggling with public health and economic impacts, maintain vital public services, and made investments that support long-term growth and opportunity. And finally, to increase access to the child tax credit, Treasury and the IRS took steps to reimagine the way IRS serves families. For the first time in history, we delivered the child tax credit in monthly payments from July to December 2021. We collaborated with Code for America to build a streamlined, mobile-friendly portal in English and Spanish to make it easier to access the child tax credit. According to a survey of more than 12,000 portal users, 24% said they had never filed taxes, and over half were people of color. At every step of implementation, we prioritized equitable delivery and sought input from a broad set of stakeholders. And now we're taking those lessons and turning our attention to the Inflation Reduction Act. The IRA will make America more competitive, lower health and energy costs for families, and create high-quality jobs, sharply lower emissions, and increase long-term economic growth. It is the most significant piece of legislation in our country's history when it comes to building a clean energy future. The law puts in place incentives to drive investment in job growth while lowering costs for American families. Nearly 3/4 of the Inflation Reduction Act's climate investments are delivered via tax incentives. Treasury has been working hard in close partnership with colleagues across the government to implement these provisions in a manner that is equitable and allows all Americans to share in the gains from the transition to a green economy. The IRS is central to any discussion on promoting equitable economic growth. We know that tax policy and administration play a significant role in the financial health and security of American families. Millions of families rely upon tax benefits and credits to support daily household expenses, pay for large and unexpected expenses like medical bills, and build wealth for the future. But for far too long, the IRS has been underfunded, resulting in disparities in audit rates and taxpayer services. The Inflation Reduction Act will enable the IRS to shift its focus to where it needs to be, on better serving taxpayers, especially working families and small businesses. This investment will be used to improve and expand customer service capabilities, bring the IRS's IT into the 21st century, reduce the tax gap by increasing enforcement on ultra-high net worth earners who are not paying their fair share of taxes, that are not paying what they owe, and re-envision benefits delivered to those to ensure that every family and small business has access to the tax credits and benefits for which they are eligible. Treasury's decision around program implementation and use of Inflation Reduction Act funds have broad-based implications for wealth and consequently health. We take this responsibility seriously and are committed to expanding health and wealth equitably through targeted investments in people, places, and infrastructure. With that, I want to thank the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene for having me here and hosting this important series. I wish you the best of luck for the rest of today's event. Thank you so much.
It's really incredible to be with you, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Dr. Michelle Morse. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for the New York City Health Department and Deputy Commissioner for the Center for Health Equity and Community Wellness at the Health Department. I do want to thank Janice Bowder for her comments as counselor to the Secretary for the U.S. Department of Treasury. And I also want to give a huge hat tip to all the members of the current administration, the commissioners, the deputy commissioners, who are all here as well this evening for the discussion. Anti-poverty measures are obviously critical for addressing economic inequities, but the racial wealth gap that we see today is the outcome of our country's history and reflects the racialized patterns of poverty in our modern era. Its effects are felt in all aspects of our society and in our health. At first glance, it might seem unusual to have a health department and Federal Reserve Bank in partnership, but in public health, our mission is to go upstream, to identify root causes, to develop solutions, and to advance the health of our communities. Our most seemingly intractable challenges require us to break out of our silos, to engage across sectors and disciplines, and that's what we're doing this evening. This is how we gain new insights, perspectives, and consensus, and make breakthroughs to ensure that our future looks different than our past. Today, on the last day of Black History Month, the legacy of Black leaders and allies in the struggle for freedom and justice for Black people calls us to honor them by making progress on the many, many challenges we faced in this country. In fact, a study just was released today that showed that more than 26 million death records showed that there are more than 74,000 excess deaths amongst Black people compared to white people between 2009 and 2018 in the 13 largest American cities. We have to build new coalitions, partnerships, and solutions to meet that incredible injustice and challenge. In recent years, we've tried to show that that's possible, including October 2021's passage of the New York City Board of Health resolution declaring racism a public health crisis. In it, the New York City Health Department is requested to partner with relevant organizations consistent with relevant local laws and executive orders to advise on assessments of structural racism within all determinants of health and to make recommendations to mitigate harm due to the cumulative impacts of these determinants within a public health context. This resolution was a historic step in our commitment to identify and redress harms that continue to harm people of color today. Around the world, a key measure of a country's health, equity, and progress is how long its people live. Here in the US, we've become accustomed to an ever-rising life expectancy, except that recent data shows us that life expectancy, of course, has not been uniformly increasing across people in this country. Most of the differences are being seen, of course, by race. In fact, data over the course of the COVID pandemic showed significant decreases in life expectancy that were differentially worse for Blacks and Hispanics in this country. As of 2020, according to the Mayor's Office of Equity, whose commissioner is here this evening, the disparity in premature mortality between Black New Yorkers and other racial and ethnic groups has widened, and has also widened amongst Hispanic groups. What's true is that all of us are harmed by these health inequities, and it's incredibly important for us to understand that we have to understand the crucial drivers of these inequities and the root causes. So along those lines, we talk a lot about income as a social determinant of health and not enough about wealth. Wealth is assets minus debt, and it's distinct from income. It may seem evident that an individual with a high income would be wealthy, but of course we know otherwise. So we, in the conversation this evening, will be talking about how we broaden our paradigm around income and discuss wealth as a driver of health inequities. Public health is one of the many important fields to advance our need to better understand the connection between wealth and health, and we have to do this, again, across sectors in partnership and with a focus on social science. Where we work, live, eat, and play all has an impact on our health, and who has access to the highest quality products in these spaces is determined by decisions we make as a society. Public health is a population-focused discipline with deep knowledge of social determinants of health. We pride ourselves in understanding the political, social, and structural drivers of health outcomes. And at the health department, addressing these inequities has been a critically important endeavor that has been shaped by structural racism in our society. If you look at heat maps in many of our cities today, our nation shows you that these inequities are clustered geographically by race and are related to the history of housing segregation, redlining, and community disinvestment. It's an honor to have former Health Commissioner Dr. Mary Bassett here. And important for us to remember that in 1921, the first ever district health centers were established in neighborhoods with the greatest health needs. These populations have unfortunately changed over time, but the health outcomes and inequities unfortunately have not. Today, we have bureaus of neighborhood health that are focused on East Tremont in the Bronx, East Harlem and Upper Manhattan, Brownsville in Brooklyn, and this is part of our strategy to reinvest in these neighborhoods to ensure that health outcomes improve. Sadly, again, the COVID pandemic revealed how healthcare segregation, racialized outcomes for COVID, disparities in wealth, and other forces test our system. The realities of our inequitable health system and the imperative to strengthen our public health infrastructure have led to investments and planning like our program, the Public Health Corps, which was a $100 million initiative focused on supporting and investing in community-based organizations to respond to the COVID pandemic across this incredible New York City community. Ultimately, bending the curve on health inequities relies on models like Public Health Corps, where investments are focused in task force on racial inclusion and equity neighborhoods that experience not only disproportionate impact from COVID, but for reasons of inequity and exclusion, lower rates of vaccination as well. I also want to highlight how important it is to introduce a reparative paradigm that's grounded in history as a part of our solutions to addressing racial health inequities in particular. One of the frameworks that I had the honor of being a part of and developing is called the Healing Arc, and it's a framework that grounds itself in acknowledgement, redress, and closure. And I developed this in partnership with my colleague, Dr. Bram Wispelwey. This framework is specifically about how we change and redress racial inequities in outcomes in healthcare institutions. And unfortunately, racism, of course, has been one of the key drivers of those racialized health outcomes at our healthcare institutions. Unfortunately, I will admit that this work, especially the race-conscious work, has led to backlash against many of us who've been involved in this kind of work for the most recent years. But what's important is that including health and making sure that all of our health outcomes are analyzed by race and ethnicity and other demographic areas allows us to develop race-conscious solutions informed by many disciplines. So in closing, I do want to say that the conversation that we're going to be having today and ones like it are unfortunately too rare, and at the same time are critical for us to generate new perspectives and new solutions to age-old problems. The racial wealth gap and how it connects to health inequities has to continue to be a priority. And I'm very excited that we've been able to work with Professor Sandy Darity and many other academic partners to develop a lot of what you're going to hear about tonight. I look forward to the panel's discussion and surfacing new insights into the health and wealth gap and solutions to this challenge. And now I'd like to turn it over to Devon Bodie, the Community Development Specialist with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, who's been an incredible partner in this work. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here today. My name is Devon Bodie, and I work here at the New York Fed, and I have the privilege of introducing and moderating our next panel. Before I get into the goals of why we are having this panel, I first want to give a disclaimer, our standard Fed disclaimer. These views are my own, and they do not represent or reflect those of the New York Fed or the Federal Reserve System. So our main goals for this panel, and what you heard from Dr. Morse, is first to highlight the difference between income and wealth. Secondly, we really want to focus on why wealth is important for health equity. So this is a lot of what you'll hear from our panelists today. And lastly, we hope that you all can walk away with meaningful, tangible, and practical applications for how you can use this in your work. Afterwards, we'll take questions from the audience, and that'll be about 15 minutes. So, be thinking of your questions that you have for our panelists. With that, I will introduce our panelists, and I invite y'all to join the stage as I introduce you. So first, we have Dr. Courtney Bowen, who is the Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. Next, we have Dr. Mary Bassett, who is the Director at the Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard University. Next, we have Nicole Carty, founder and coordinator of Project Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations. And last but not least, we have Commissioner Sadeas Sherman from the New York City's Mayor's Office of Equity. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our panel today. I think before we get started, we wanted to ground this conversation in data. So I do have a couple of slides. Some that were recommended by you all, and let's get started. So before I begin asking our panelists different questions, I just wanted to show everyone this slide from our own survey of consumer finances. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this before. Some may not have, but this shows the mean and the median net worth by race and ethnicity in 2019. We only have 2 races and 1 ethnicity, but there are many more in the United States. But this is just to show the breadth of the disparity that exists. So according to the Survey of Consumer Finances, the median white household has 8 times the wealth of the typical Black household and 5 times the wealth of the typical Hispanic or Latino household. And this disparity is greater when you look at the mean net worth. So we've been working with the New York City Department of Health to write a white paper about this. And this white paper, the title is Analyzing the Racial Wealth Gap and Implications for Health Equity, which I hope all of you grabbed a copy of out front. I think a very important paper that we cited very often in this white paper was yours, Dr. Bowen. You wrote a paper beyond net worth, and I think that was critical, and we reviewed it heavily in our own white paper. And I think I would love for us to start with you explaining your findings of what you found in that white paper and explain what exactly is the connection between wealth and health.
Great. So first, can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. So first, thanks so much for having us here. This is really a delight, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I think we started, Dr. Morse did a really nice job of sort of laying out this distinction between income and wealth, but I just want to reiterate it because I think it's a really important distinction. When many of us think about income, what we're talking about is sort of the flow of resources that comes into a household, typically through earnings and labor market earnings. When we're talking about wealth, what we're talking about is what a household owns, net of what it owes. And so you can think about that as the sum of the assets of a household, net of any debts, right? And so I think that's an important distinction because, of course, both are related to health in important ways, right? And they're related to each other, though not often as directly as we might expect. And a lot of my work has focused on thinking about why wealth in particular is so important for health and the health of people and populations. And I want to first sort of ground this conversation of why in the United States we see such staggering levels of health inequality by wealth. And part of that is because we've designed a system where people's access to the many material resources needed to live a long and healthy life depend on their ability to purchase those resources using financial resources. Right? So when we think about access to, for example, to quality healthcare, to safe and affordable housing, to food, these are resources. People and families need their own resources to be able to purchase those important health resources. And in the United States, we also have a comparatively very weak social safety net, right? And so I want to ground the conversation there because it may be possible that the relationship between wealth and health would look different in other places with a stronger social safety net, where people aren't required to sort of finance their own medical care in the way that they are here in the United States. But when we think about the distinction here in the US between income and wealth and why it matters for health, you can think about wealth as providing a cushion for families and for individuals that allows them to weather financial storms. So if wages, for example, are temporarily suspended, somebody loses a job. We saw this a lot during COVID. How do you pay for your bills? How do you pay rent and pay car payments if your earnings are temporarily halted? We see this with older adults, right, as they exit the paid labor market or not. Who can afford to retire? And what is the quality of their life when they do so? Right, and so this is why wealth matters, that it provides really this cushion for families and for individuals in ways that support health. I mean, the other part of this too is that, I know we're going to talk a lot about the importance of wealth for understanding racial inequality in the United States. But a key point about wealth too is that a lot of what US households do is pass on class status to their descendants through their wealth, right? And this is a key mechanism that perpetuates and exacerbates inequality over time. But you can think about why, how wealth might be used as a financial resource that parents, for example, use to finance their children's education in the United States, right? And so, the paper that you referenced of mine sort of was taking on this idea that when we think of wealth, it's really this summary measure of all of the assets that a household owns, net of its debts, but it's comprised of a variety of different types of assets and debts, right? And we might imagine that the various assets and debts relate to health in different ways, right? And so, some of the work that I've been doing, for example, has shown that the sort of liquid assets that a household has, those things that can be easily converted to cash in a moment of uncertainty or difficulty, things like how much a family has in a checking or savings account, whether they have access to retirement accounts, for example, that those are really critical for health, as is home ownership, right? Because what it provides is not only sort of the safety of a place of refuge for an individual and their family, but it's often, because of racial segregation and inequality in the United States, an indicator of the type of neighborhood often where people live and the access to resources that they have. But it's not just assets, right? So we can think about this with debts too. There are debts that we know are more harmful to health than others, right? The debt, for example, that a family might have for taking out a mortgage on a home might not be as stressful as a sort of an unsecured debt that was taken out to, say, finance a subprime rate on student loans, for example. Right, that there's certain debts that are incredibly stressful for people to have to manage in ways that I think is important to sort of drive this conversation that not all debts are created equal, and the way that they relate to health varies.
Thank you, Dr. Bowen.
Yeah.
I think you made a really important point on how differing assets and debts have different and meaningful impacts on health. I think that really takes us into our next slide, which was a very large learning curve for myself. So this next slide shows premature mortality. And I'm sure our audience, our panelists can explain premature mortality much better than I can, but this shows it for New York City residents who died before the age of 65, so prematurely. As of 2020, the disparity of premature mortality between Black New Yorkers and other racial groups has widened. And as you see in the later years, for Hispanic and Latino, is now higher than white New Yorkers. Yeah. So, Dr. Bassett, you have a prolific career, and no, I don't expect you to explain why this is, but to shed some light would be helpful. You have such a prolific career. You know, you've devoted and promoted health equity and social justice, and when we had the chance to talk before, you did mention premature mortality. So my question for you is, why is the racial wealth gap a public health concern, and what does this have to do with our discussion today?
Sure. So first, I also want to echo what Courtney has said, that this is just so exciting to have this meeting take place. And I want to give thanks to the Federal Reserve. My mother was so impressed that I was coming down here. And also to the health department. And I've run into many old friends from the city health department. I also have somebody here from the state health department, Dr. Bauer. I want her to know that I talked about these issues as the state health commissioner as well. I like the measure of premature mortality because people can understand it. Life expectancy is a bit of an abstract concept. Usually in public health, we use it at life expectancy at birth, meaning what the likelihood is of a newborn living a certain life, whereas everybody understands what it means to die before you're 65. And I think all of us would agree, although I'm old enough now to have lost friends, age cohorts of mine, people I went to high school, college, medical school, trained with, before the age of 65, and all of us agree that that is too young. People shouldn't die that young. And many people think that this type of graph is really a measure of the impact of racism, that premature mortality may be the single best summary measure of the health impact of racism. Now, I've been looking at racial variations in life expectancy, premature death rates for a very long time. These have persisted. The impact of COVID has been quite catastrophic. Actually, the worst costs, and I've promised myself always to mention this, although most of my work is on black-white differences, is among the indigenous, who have lost more years of life than any other group and now have a life expectancy of 65 years, which is matched in our hemisphere only by the nation of Haiti, one of the poorest countries in the world. So COVID had a catastrophic impact, but these differences, as this graph shows, have been, in place for ever since we've had vital registration data. When we look at income, it makes these differences attenuate, but they've never gone away. People often say that the racism effect is explained by poverty. But when we use income as a measure of poverty, we continue to see a racial gap. So income and race are not equivalent in terms of their impact. There's a tax that's due to race even among middle-class people. Probably one of the most telling stories of that is not on premature mortality, but infant mortality rates, in which middle class, college-educated, presumably middle class, that's what people hope they'll be when they become college-educated. Women had preterm births that were at much higher rates, and even the data from New York shows that a high school graduate who's white has an infant mortality rate that's equivalent to a college graduate who's black. So so the importance of wealth is exactly what Courtney has been talking about, that this may be an important part of our missing information about what explains the persistence of racial differences in health. Our data are so much better for income, but when we do look at wealth, it's clear that it has an important additive effect on health outcomes, including mortality. So I don't know how I can keep talking about this kind of stuff for a long time, but I'm sure you have probably about 20 questions.
I do, and so does the audience.
So, so this is a good outcome measure, and I would say that one of the important insights that we've had in recent years is that the black-white wealth gap may be the best summary metric of the price that's been paid due to 250 years of enslaved labor, the black codes, Jim Crow, and the continued use of race as a marker for social exclusion. So it's the exposure, and premature mortality is the outcome.
Thank you. Nicole.
I think the next question is going to be for you.
Yeah. And Nicole, this is exactly what we talked about on our call, the historical context. So I would love for you to explain more about why does the racial wealth gap exist from your perspective or from what you've been studying, especially with your foundation. Please explain more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you so much for having us all here. I have never been in this building before, but I've been in the area a lot for organizing. And yeah, this is the first, I'll say. But I think what is I was out here actually for Occupy Wall Street many years ago. And one thing that I was really trying to push, I don't know how successfully in that movement, was that we shouldn't be talking just about income inequality. We should be talking about wealth inequality, because wealth is a measure of money plus history. History is involved in wealth. And so when you think about the racial wealth gap, an important thing to understand is it was designed, right? It's not an accident. It didn't come from nowhere. It was designed through policy by people with a purpose in mind. And that purpose was to actually make it easier for them to keep wealth and power to themselves. When we talk about 400 years ago, slavery, the purpose of the motivations of that time were not about creating a system of discrimination for fun. They were about creating a justification for exploitation of labor and for taking land. You mentioned indigenous health. It's a similar situation, right? And so out of a need to have a reason and to be able to justify why you should enslave somebody permanently, around how you would prevent a unified middle class or working class rising up against people who are exploiting everyone, in that context, race is created. Blackness created as a group of people who are subhuman, right, who then can be exploited, indefinitely enslaved permanently. Whiteness as a metric of creating a new alliance of people across class differences in solidarity and incentivized to see themselves and to see their stakes as different than those of Black people. And I say this to say that when we talk about the racial wealth gap, we're actually reaffirming this construction. These are constructed political groupings that have existed for the past 400 years and were created through the use of law, through anti-miscegenation laws to actually prohibit and use violence against people who were indentured servants from Africa, mixing with people who were indentured servants from Europe, right? They had to actually force this. And so the result of all of this is within our racial wealth gap. There's actually a Brookings Institute study that shows that our broader wealth gap exists within our racial wealth gap, right? And so if you were to even out wealth distribution between everybody, white people and Black people, everyone who's not in the top 10%, there would still be an 80% remaining racial wealth gap. So 90% of all white people, if you were to equalize the wealth that they had and the wealth of Black people, you still have 80% of the wealth gap existing. And the reason for this is because the purpose of it was to create an ability to siphon resources to the upper highest echelons of people in this country. And that system fundamentally hasn't been intervened upon. It hasn't been shifted. It still exists today, where we see this giant concentration of wealth and that is perpetuating, that exists in our society, right? You see the wages of whiteness, right? You see the deaths of despair, which are on the rise right now. This is an outcome of our inability to really repair and come together across this racial, this legacy of slavery and injustice. So I just need to say that because I think when we talk about the wealth gap, it's important to talk about the origin and the purpose of why it was created and why we still have it. And what it will take in order to actually fix it. The evidence is all there. It was created with policy, and we actually need to fix it with historically conscious policy that can redress the damage and redress these lies and laws that have been created for the purpose of siphoning wealth up to the highest, wealthiest people in our society. So that's a little bit of where this comes from, and I'm looking forward to getting deeper into this as we continue. Yeah.
Commissioner Sherman, so you are New York City's first commissioner at the Mayor's Office of Equity, and this office was only created last year. That does deserve. I would love if you could shine some light on what is the mission of the Mayor's Office of Equity and why was it created, especially when thinking about COVID-19 and the impacts of that on New York City and New Yorkers.
Sure. So I just echo my colleagues that we're really excited to be here, and thank you to the Federal Reserve and the Department of Health for really bringing this conversation together. So, you know, the Office of Equity, the mission is really straightforward. It's to foster a more fair and equitable city, and that's a big goal. But achievable. And, you know, the way in which we've organized our work is really in 3 areas, right? Focusing on the infrastructure and the structure of government, right, to really ensure that we're dismantling structural racism throughout government and building systems that can improve the way in which we serve New Yorkers, that we're focused on culture within government as well, too, to make sure that we actually are building the culture that can support long-term change, and that we're still driving real-time outcomes, policies, programs, initiatives that are serving New Yorkers here and now. And so to your point, a lot of our work grew out of the pandemic, right? I had the honor of leading the Task Force on Racial Inclusion and Equity during the pandemic, which focused on, and with Department of Health, identified the neighborhoods that were most impacted by COVID. And so if you think about that in context of this conversation, if you lay out that map of the 33 most impacted neighborhoods, this overlays with many of the communities that have been redlined. This overlays with many of the communities that have been digitally redlined, right? A lot of the other socioeconomic disparities that we see within our city are across these communities. And so it's not a surprise that these were the communities that were the most impacted. And so, during that period, in the midst of, an emergency of epic proportion, what we heard from communities was that not only did we need to respond to the issues at hand, but we needed to make sure that we don't put these broken systems back in place, that we return and reestablish ourselves as a city that is addressing these deeply rooted disparities that are the reason why those neighborhoods were impacted in the way that they were. And so we sort of step into this work within the Adams administration in establishing this new Mayor's Office of Equity with that context. And then we have this additional context with the understanding that this November, New Yorkers also voted into law, right, in the city charter, a requirement now that the city has an Office of Racial Equity, a Commission on Racial Equity, citywide racial equity plans, a true cost of living measure, a preamble that sets a vision for equity. So there's this forward momentum, which is now codified through law, which gives the city a really great platform, right, to begin to dismantle structural racism within city government and in our city at large, but also begin to ideally build a model for work that can impact the rest of our country. So to your point, right, we didn't get here overnight, and the racial wealth gap is a result of policy, whether it's redlining or digital redlining or excluding, agricultural workers from the New Deal or, the Cross Bronx Expressway, right? Like we can identify many examples of the ways in which policies have created the gaps that we see. And so it makes absolute sense that policy needs to be in the toolkit that we use to address this. And so there are a number of, initiatives that are happening across our administration from, working with the state to expand the EITC so that working families are able to keep more of what they earn, to expanding childcare, which we know is critical to ensuring that people can participate fully in the workforce, to even some more recent efforts, which are increasing the threshold where we can really target contracts to MWBE vendors and also focus more deeply on the disparity within the disparity. But one of the programs that, and policy areas that we've been focused on in our office is really an upstream intervention in partnership with a great organization, NYC Kids Rise, who I'll shout out, who's in the room as well today. And we've been working with them to really expand the Safer College program, which is ensuring that every child who enters a New York City public school has a New York City scholarship account that's linked to a 529 account. And so what this means that every child from last year moving forward indefinitely has an asset that they can use towards college and career. And so this is important, right? When you think about, what this means, I think about it in my own life, right? As someone who literally just paid off their loans with the help of the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, another policy, right? I know how impactful this can be for individuals and families to get ahead. But we also just see it in the data, right? A child with $100 to $500 in a 529 account is 3 times more likely to go to college, 4 times more likely to graduate. We've seen in communities where low-income communities, 1 in every 91 children had a 529. Now every child has access to this important tool. But what's also really exciting, and this is really credit to NYC Kids Rise and all the partners who've built this, is that this is also like a community-based model for wealth building. So not only is there philanthropic and city and other investment, there's ways in which communities are mobilizing to invest in the children in their neighborhood to ensure that every child understands that there's an expectation for their future, there's an investment in their future, there's exposure to college and career, there's financial education in the classroom, there's a robust way in which we're supporting all of our children to succeed. And so, these are some of the types of policies, right, that cities can choose to implement. These are the types of partnerships that cities can invest in, identifying strategies that are proven to work and really working collaboratively to expand them so that we can be targeted and focused in the way in which we invest our resources so that we see a benefit on the long end. The one thing that I would just add in the context of all of this is that, because of racism, because of this legacy that brought us here, this is also really fragile too, right? So when you think about the racial wealth gap and even, things that have helped families, Black families, for instance, advance like home ownership or business ownership, it's still all very fragile if you don't have the conditions otherwise, right, that still support people to succeed, right? So I think about my own family who comes from the agricultural South. They were landowners, which is not very common, right, that they were able to hold on to their land. But when my grandmother migrated north, she started at square one again, right? So she lived in a tenement, she worked in a factory, she lived in public housing, she saved up to buy a house. So then my mom grew up in public housing, right, and was able to provide more for me. But I grew up in a segregated neighborhood. I grew up in a neighborhood in New York City that still doesn't have walkable access to a grocery store. So even with that forward progression, it's still very incremental unless we as a society and certainly as the government create the conditions that ensure that people can not only build wealth, but they can hold on to it, right? And they can really, their children and their children's children can really realize those gains.
Oh, yeah.
Are we allowed to ask each other?
Of course.
Well, thanks. I'm really impressed with what you've just talked about. I just wondered if it's sort of like baby bonds. Is it what you've just described? It's a universal program that.
And can you describe baby bonds too for those in our audience who might not know what it is?
Sure. So I would say it is very similar, and I think the distinction is that this is at when entering kindergarten versus birth.
So it's not at birth.
And and this is tied with, it's a 529, right? So it's tied to college and career. So it's a very similar model, but it's tied to the school system. And it's also available to all charter school students. And so one of the things that's unique is like leveraging the school system to create this universal platform. And when you think about the composition of DOE schools, almost 25% of students are Black, over 40% are Latino, over 71% are economically disadvantaged. So it really captures a lot of the students that we want to reach in New York City in addition to those in our charter schools.
So, congratulations, and to NYC Kids Rising for getting that done. But whatever this does, it's an advance, and it won't come anywhere close to touching the Black-white wealth gap.
Yeah.
I've been looking at this a long time. I hope in this discussion that I have the chance to say that I support monetary reparations, that I think that it is the only way that we will overcome the Black-white wealth gap, and that as a nation, and that we can't just say that overcoming the disadvantages that fell upon people who were enslaved in this country by individual effort in the face of opportunity, it's just not enough. We won't get there. And we've heard from all the panelists the penalty that we're paying as a nation for our failure to come to terms with our legacy. People like James Baldwin was able to put these things much more lyrically than I can, as I'm a medical doctor. But I do read. But he wrote a book called "The Fire Next Time." Do you remember? That's from a slave song. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more flood. The fire next time. And his point was, we have to come to terms with this, or we are condemning our future. And reparations won't be enough, let's be clear, to solve all the inequities that exist in our society. But I think it's an important step. I've just seen a 5-minute warning go up, so I should turn this back to the chair. But just to say that universal interventions, I think, are great. Talking about support to, little children, sort of committing their families to the idea that this kindergartner is going to go to college is really an important step, but it won't be enough. it certainly won't overcome the wealth gap or the health gap.
I think you guys just pointed out some really important policies that states and localities could use. I think in our research with the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, we kind of focused on 3 areas where solutions could exist. The first being data collection, how we collect data. The second being public policy, and the third being community ownership. So maybe we can, in this panel, from hearing from each of you on what you think are the most promising or effective strategies, policies, practices that would work in your own fields or fields that we have not talked about yet. And Courtney, I would love for you to speak more to what are the gaps in data collection that are currently exist right now that we should know about.
That's great. So first, I just want to echo what Dr. Bassett said and say that I want to go on the record, unlike the folks at the Fed, I can go on the record by saying that a reparations program, I think, is the only way forward if we're really committed to an idea of equity and redressing past harms, which I think is part of, I've learned a tremendous amount from Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen on this front about the need to acknowledge and redress past harm as a path forward. I'm a researcher, and so I'm more than happy to talk about data for the next 2 hours for anyone who will listen to me. But this is a huge challenge, and I really see this as sort of a threefold. When I was thinking about the data infrastructure and the lack of data infrastructure to support high-quality research in this area, sort of 3 key gaps came to mind. The first is that we just don't have many high-quality data sets that follow the same people over time that have high-quality health data and high-quality wealth data. It's a real challenge, right? And so, it's unsurprising to me when you were showing data on the magnitude of the racial wealth gap and racialized inequities and wealth that you use data from the Survey of Consumer Finances. This is a really high-quality wealth data set. But they have terrible health data in that survey, right? And so part of the challenge, I think, is that it is really challenging to collect data on wealth because it is this multi-dimensional construct that's asking people about all the assets that they own as well as all the debts that they owe. And health is also really this multi-dimensional complex process that unfolds across the life course as people age. But I think, in order to sort of move this work forward, we have to think about that data infrastructure. The other really important thing that I think the Survey of Consumer Finances does really well is it captures high wealth ownership in the United States, which most surveys don't. We have a lot of data on folks with low levels of wealth and sort of study them as the problem, right? And rather than thinking about the higher end of the wealth distribution, and why is there this absence? There's this focus, almost this laser focus in research on the lowest wealth earners and owners in the United States, right? And so I think that's also a real challenge. And sort of last, but I think really related to this, is that in social science, what I do, and in public health, we have a tendency to study people, but not the institutions that create the context in which people live and work. Right, and so, we have lots of great data on household wealth and how it's related to health, but what are the institutional mechanisms that are allowing some families and households to accrue more wealth or more debts? And what are those institutional mechanisms that are excluding people from those same instruments of wealth accumulation? And so, my thinking about where the work needs to go is we need also better data on institutions and their roles in generating all of the processes that we've seen here. This is going to allow us to see the forest through the trees. Just studying people that have been sort of bearing the burden of these systems over time is going to be insufficient, especially from a policy perspective. If we're interested in intervention and policy, it's going to require us taking a hard look at the institutional mechanisms generating all of the inequalities that you showed on those slides earlier.
I think it would be really great if we could get from the Federal Reserve wealth data that could be matched with administrative data sets. And that would require personal identifiers. That's how we do the matches, and we strip the data sets, and then they can be analyzed with the protection of anonymity to the people who've contributed the data. That would be really terrific. So in addition to what you've mentioned, Dr. Bowen, and it's not surprising, people should know that she started out her working life in a health department, so we stamped her. That would be great. And I just learned when I walked in the door and passed the patrolling police officers that there is in fact actual gold related to this building. But I also think of the Federal Reserve as a real treasure trove of wealth data. And if we could somehow crosswalk it with our administrative data on health, so we have a national death index, for example, we could do analyses that currently aren't possible. We have such thin data. There are only two longitudinal databases that I'm familiar with, the panel study on income dynamics and the health and retirement study. So that's one thing that would be really great for the Federal Reserve to turn its attention to making wealth data usable in concert with health data, either by collecting the health data or permitting it to be matched. The other is a really important point that you raise, that the harms haven't only fallen on individual households. The harms have fallen on whole communities, on housing quality, on the conditions of parks, the availability of supermarkets, the forms of policing, the educational quality, the hospitals. A study that's cited in the white paper shows that it would take something like $30 million per Black serving hospital to equalize its capital reserves to those of white hospitals. So these are literally structural differences that are never going to be under the control of individual households. If we equalize the wealth gap, I think that we would put Black communities in better position to be active politically. So that would be a good thing. But we need to attend to the costs that have been paid, that have been collective ones. So we need better measures of those deficiencies. Some of that work has been done in the capital that is available to the public sector, for example, which more often serves a disproportionate share of people of color. So those are my two, and I'll stop at two.
Nicole? Yeah, I'll go. And I'm not going to be up here and talk about data that we need to collect, because that is not my field. But what I do think that we need to do is I work in organizing, and so what I think there's a deficit of is political will around this. There are some studies that show this gap is not going to close on its own. It actually requires the redistribution, the reparations to actually heal the harms that it is derived from. And I think that what we need to do is to start telling a story about where this gap came from and why, and what our responsibility is in actually healing it. We're not on a chill, non-moving train. We're on a moving train, right? We either have the option to intervene and redress and repair, or we are responsible for damning 6 more generations of Black people, at the very least, to the same outcomes, the same misfortunes as have been going on through history. So, thank you. So, we're actors in this, right? And we need to be telling a clear story about where this came from and why. It was made by policy, and we need historically conscious policy to repair it. I'm going to be short. That's what we need. Yeah.
Sure. So there's so many places. I don't even remember the original question, but I think in the area of data, I don't have much to add other than not only do we have insufficient data on wealth, we also have insufficient data on what it costs to live in New York, right? And so I shared earlier that by virtue of these recent ballot measures, the city is now required to produce a true cost of living measure, and I think this is really fundamental in thinking about how we allocate resources, how we make decisions, who we consider poor, right, who we consider in need. The federal poverty guidelines are insufficient, completely insufficient, to understand what an individual or family needs. And so I think in addition to understanding where people are within the spectrum of wealth, also really understanding who can afford to live in New York also impacts the way in which we make decisions. And so that's something that's important, and I'm excited that we'll be rolling that out. The other area that I would add is, I think that, to your point, I think there's lots of power in universal programs, as well as universal programs that you can make targeted, right? Which there's ways in which we can target those programs, but there is certainly an importance of redressing past harms, right? Having large-scale interventions that are impacting Americans, but particularly Black Americans, within the legacy of slavery. And I think that's not only a role for our government institutions, but I think that's also a role for our private institutions and private companies as well. The last thing I would add is, I think, we have like a very real-time example of this, or opportunity, when we think about the cannabis industry and how it rolls out in New York City and New York State, where we have the benefit of learning from other cities, right, and learning from some of the challenges. We have a really dynamic Cannabis NYC director who's done this work nationally, which is very exciting. And there's been advocacy, right, and lots of accountability because of that advocacy to ensure that the policies that are rolling out at the state as well as at the city level are really focusing on the New Yorkers and the communities that have been most harmed. I had the opportunity to join the beginning of like an engagement, listening, learning tour up in the Bronx, which literally started the tour in public housing in the Bronx, in one of the most harmed communities. And I know that there is a concerted effort from the city to ensure that this is an equitable cannabis industry, that the folks who enter this industry are not concentrated in the areas that are least profitable, that these are businesses that are accountable to community, right? Like all the things that are be necessary to ensure that this is an equitable industry. I think this is an opportunity for us to apply some of these principles and also think about the ways in which we focus our efforts on communities most harmed in real time with an industry that is moving very quickly, and where there could be a lot of opportunity to ensure that people who were extracted from communities many, many years ago, in the communities that were devastated by that impact, can actually begin to use some of that wealth that will be generated to build individual and community wealth, as well as, right, the tax revenues that also should be supporting those communities as well.
Well, let's take a couple questions from our audience. I think we only have time for maybe one or two.
My name is Maritza Owens. I'm the CEO and founder of Harvest Stone Farmers Market. And the question I have is there any study been done about the impact of SNAP on racial wealth and health? Because one of the frustrating things for me is that we keep enrolling people in SNAP as a way for health, but that is not the way to either achieve health or wealth. Yeah. What is the answer?
I don't know the answer. We have somebody here from the State Health Department. Do you, Dr. Bauer, happen to know? I don't. I mean, this is a program that's run by the State Health Department. And it refers to food subsidies. We used to call this food stamps.
What we do a lot of in public health is try to mitigate the impact of inequities, of the racial wealth gap, and we don't do a good job of solving the problem. And I think what we're here trying to do is figure out how to solve the problem. So I do appreciate that point.
Mm-hmm. We'll take one more question. And I just want to say there will be a reception afterwards, and I hope some of our panelists will be staying after so you can ask in person as well.
Hi. Felicia Pullen, and I am also a founder of an organization specifically in Harlem. And so much of my focus is on the disparate deaths of Blacks and Latinos due to addiction. And so good to see you again, Dr. Bassett. I've often worked with the mayor's office and with New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene to talk about the issues that are impacting Blacks and Latinos in Harlem. And I often get the response of, we have 3 more years of our current mayor, or the city moves really slowly. And while that's happening, I'm watching people die outside of my doors. And so I would like to hear your advice as to how I can get the wheels of the city to move a little more quickly as we are on the ground addressing these disparities.
I'm not
I mean,
sure.
so I can jump. I mean, I feel like my health department
can't
colleagues.
represent New York City.
Yeah, so I can jump in. I mean, I think one, it'd be great to connect, and I know a lot of our colleagues in the health department are here today. And what you're describing is an urgent challenge, right? And I know that there's a sense of urgency internally right now as well too. So we can make sure to connect, and you'll hear from some of our health department colleagues on that.
Well, can everyone please give a round of applause for So thank you, Dr. Bowen, Dr. Bassett, Nicole, and Commissioner Sherman. Next, we will have some brief reflections from Dr. Morse, and then we'll go into some closing remarks.
Thank you again. Thank you for being a part of this conversation this evening. Thank you for the questions, and thank you most of all to our moderator and panelists. I will not say this is the first time I've had the opposite of a manel, and to have all women up here to have this conversation, I think it really does send a strong statement. And happy again to continue the conversation in just a moment. I just wanted to underline a few reflections that came up during the panel discussion. We heard a lot about the difference between income and wealth. We also heard about the power of using premature mortality as an indicator and as a way to summarize the collective impacts of racism. We also talked about missing data, and that missing data is not only wealth data that we don't have at the individual or institutional level, but also missing data on Indigenous people, and you saw reflections of that in the graphs that were shown. We talked about the origins of the racial wealth gap and how important it is for us to have the historical context. And we also started some conversations about the work that's already happened to address some of these issues, including the historic charter vote that just happened this past fall. And finally, we did start the conversation about solutions, and we hope to continue it with all of you and our partners at the Fed. We talked about data solutions, again, for both individuals and institutions. We talked about policies, the need for political will, including policies like reparations, and we didn't get into the conversation about community ownership as much as perhaps we could have, but there's an opportunity for us to do that. So in terms of a call to action for all of you as members of the audience, again, this is not a new conversation. It's also just the beginning of this phase of the conversation at the health department. So I'd encourage all of you to take a copy of the white paper. Again, just hot off the presses. It might feel hot. It just literally came out today. We also have a QR code. Wow, you guys are organized. If only it worked that easy all the time. So please do take a pic of the QR code, pick up a copy of the Racial Wealth Gap. Please do read it, as was referenced. There's a lot packed in here, but a lot of great conversation can come from the discussion of this white paper. We'd also encourage all of you to share the white paper with colleagues that you think would benefit from reading it and use it in any way that you see fit to expand the conversation across sectors and disciplines about the root causes of the racial wealth gap and the solutions to it and how it connects to health. The final two things I want to say is I had the pleasure of being involved in some research, and some of the folks in the audience were also involved at this, looking at reparations and what the impact of reparations would have been if they had been instituted for Black American descendants of slaves prior to the COVID pandemic. And specifically, it looked at what Dr. Bone was speaking about, the fact that with wealth, there's a possibility to live in higher standard housing. There's a possibility to not necessarily be a frontline essential worker who isn't as protected. There's a possibility to buy basic things like hand sanitizer and masks. And of course, all of the other things that come along with wealth. The model in this research showed that if reparations had been paid, COVID transmission would have been 30 to 68% lower during the COVID pandemic. So the benefit would have been reaped by the whole entire community. And I really think it gets at the conversation we just had about both the need to understand wealth at the individual level as well as the institutional level. Last but not least, we're very excited that we're going to be at the Health Department partnering with CUNY, Professor Sandy Darity, and many others to actually move forward with doing a racial wealth gap survey here in New York City in 2023. And that is hopefully going to help to move forward the conversation about local data across racial and ethnic groups in New York City so that we can better understand, again, the connection to health outcomes. So with that, I'm going to pass it to my boss, Commissioner Dr. Ashwin Vasan, to share some closing remarks, and thank you again.
Thank you, Michelle. What a wonderful event. Can we give it up for the speakers and the panel, and especially for Dr. Morse. Her leadership and her vision in this work is really a sight to see, and I'm very honored to be your colleague. I'm not your boss, I'm your colleague. I'll also say my disclaimer, this does represent my views, and it does represent the views of the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. I also want to note that it's 2013, and it's 2023, and in 2013, Dr. Bassett became Commissioner of Health of New York City, and there was no conversation around this. There was no conversation in the context of premature mortality and life expectancy loss and the racial and racialized outcomes underneath them. And it's a real testament to Dr. Bassett's leadership and her vision for moving this city forward in this direction. And it's a legacy that I'm very proud to inherit. Also want to thank you. Yeah, that's right. I also want to thank the colleagues at the Federal Reserve for elevating this issue. You know, so often those of us who work in health find ourselves on the outside looking in when there are these big discussions around economic policy or fiscal policy, all the while knowing that the decisions that are taken in those rooms are going to have major impacts on the communities we serve, the neighborhoods we serve, the patients we serve, the people we serve. An event like today represents a shift, a beginning of a shift at least, to driving a conversation, understanding the near and long-term ripple effects of our economic policy, and importantly, wealth inequality, and how that is the cumulative result of our choices. You know, Dr. Morris and Dr. Bassett will started where I'll end. The impacts of the racial wealth gap and wealth inequality are all too real, especially now, at a time of a loss of life expectancy, unprecedented in over a century, driven by the pandemic, but also by rising burdens of chronic disease, overdose and mental illness, birth inequity and violence. It's more important than ever that public health and public policy reorient itself to stopping and reversing this decline. Here in New York City, we're reorienting our public health agency, our public health strategies, and our entire system to doing just that. But it's going to be impossible to do so without addressing the racialized and disproportionate burden of premature mortality faced by Black and brown New Yorkers. And in turn, the cumulative and inherited effect of disparities in wealth that are prime contributors to that burden. I also want to say it's impossible, and this is again something that the health department has led on for over a decade, it's impossible to separate out the race-based effects and impacts without talking about place-based effects and impacts. racial segregation and place and corresponding investment or lack of investment are so deeply place-based in a city like New York and frankly all across our country. And I'm very proud to be in a city that has at least started the process through the Task Force on Racial Inclusion and Equity of defining where, at the zip code level, where investments haven't been made and where investments need to be made. However crude or not crude we think that measure is, it's a starting point for doing exactly the sort of reparative investment that we've been crying out for decades, if not centuries. So I just want to thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Fed for putting on this event. Thank you to my colleagues at the Health Department for leading on this issue. It's going to take ongoing collaborations just like this one, and this is very much a beginning of a conversation, but I think there are opportunities, especially coming out of the worst of the pandemic, to drive these conversations into practice, and into action. And so I'm looking forward to that work together with all of you, and thank you.
All right, well, we've reached the end of our programming. Thank you, Commissioner Vassan, for our closing remarks. I would like to give another thank you to the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene and all of my colleagues at the New York Fed, and to our panelists for joining us here today. Outside, we will be having a reception, so please just make your way out there. If you are going to exit, please exit at the A level. And thank y'all for coming. Have a great night.